Welcome, everybody. I'm Elaine Ikeda with Lead California. I just want to take a moment. Some of us are from California, and we had some crazy, crazy weather yesterday. So I'm really grateful we could, we're all here to put on this webinar, and thank you for those of you who had to survive that. So just take a moment and take a deep breath and settle in. For us in California, it's a couple minutes after 11, but I know some of you are in other time zones, and this is already the middle of your day or the late afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who are not familiar with Lead California, we're a coalition of college and university presidents in California who are committed to educating our students to change our world. We host numerous events that offer professional development to community-engaged scholars and practitioners, promoting service learning and other forms of community-engaged scholarships, awards, and student fellowships. I'm excited that you're joining us for our third webinar presentation. We've done some conference presentations as well. In an ongoing series focusing on transforming promotion and tenure in higher education. We are hosting this webinar series with our partners at Collaboratory and North Carolina Campus Engagement. We held our first webinar over a year ago in fall 2023 with an overview framing the conversation. And this past fall, November 8th, we had Dr. Emily Ozer from UNCG, who did a deeper dive into sharing the institutional transformations of her campus over 10 years ago, and what they were finding since then in implementation of those promotion tenure guideline changes. And then later this spring in April 16th, we'll be having another webinar focusing on the departmental level and institutional change with Drs. Andy Furco, Jennifer Yee, and David Donahue. And we'll share that again at the end of the webinar. So today we're grateful. There's already 70 people online here, and we had 170-ish sign up actually for this webinar. So we're really grateful for your interest. And today's webinar is Promising Promotion and Tenure Reforms for Societally Impact Research, Strategies and Opportunities. We're going to do a quick poll while we continue to let people come in. So we'll share a poll. We just want to get a sense of what role you play on your campus or in your community. And just so the presenters today have a quick sense of who's, so to speak, in the room. And while you're doing that, I'm going to review just a few logistics. As I said, we're recording this, so you will have a chance. You can rewatch it, or if you have to leave early, don't fear, you will be emailed a recording. We will do an email follow-up, and it'll include links to the recording and links to the report that this webinar is about, and other links that are brought up during the conversation. You can also always find our previously recorded webinars, and this one will be posted there as well up on our Lead California website. So I think it looks like people are somewhat slowing down on the poll. So we have 45% faculty, 43% administrators, 31% staff and center directors. We have a few community partners with us. Thank you for joining. A couple students and a couple who marked others. And I know for many of you, you probably serve in multiple roles and we forced you to pick one. So we can probably close out that poll. And let's see, I want to let you know, I highly recommend you use SpeakerView because we have a panel. There's going to be multiple speakers, and so we didn't, with trying to do all the logistics, it's a little more challenging to spotlight people and hop back and forth. So I highly recommend you use speaker view up in your right-hand corner if you're on a screen. And we'd like you to stay muted through the whole presentation. And let's see. So the flow of the day, or the morning, we're gonna have the panel speak first, and then we'll move into Q&A section. Many of you provided questions on the registration form, and thank you very much. I do believe many of your questions will get answered as we go through. If you have questions that come up during the session, please post those in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring those. And we hope to have about 20 to 30 minutes left at the end for Q&A. So with that, I think I got everything. It's my honor to introduce you to Benjamin Olneck-Brown, an officer with Pew Charitable Trusts who works with the Transforming Evidence Funders Network to broaden incentives and build infrastructure for public impact and engagement in research systems. Benjamin will share more information with you about the research project, and he will introduce the rest of the panel. So Benjamin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Elaine, and thank you all for being here. Elaine tells me that this is really great turnout for this webinar, and I'm excited to hear that because we've learned a great deal from the presenters you're going to hear from today, and I think that they have a lot of interesting and timely information to share for everyone here as well. So, as Elaine said, my name is Benjamin Olneck-Brown. I'm an officer on the Evidence Project with the Pew Charitable Trusts. Pew, for those who don't know, is more than a polling entity. We are a public charity that uses data and evidence to inform the public, improve public policy, and invigorate civic life. And my team here coordinates the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, through which we are working with other research funders across issue areas and across the world who believe that maximizing the public impact of their research investments on issues of pressing societal importance is a crucial enabling condition for each of these goals and for each of their organizational missions as well. Our work grew out of environmental grant-making programs here at Pew, particularly the Lenfest Ocean program, that support co-productive approaches to conservation research, bringing together fisheries and coastal resource managers, tribes, and other key partners to set research agendas, conduct research, and use timely findings in their decision-making about how to protect oceans and how to conserve landscapes for ecosystems and for people. About 4 years ago, we formed a partnership with the William T. Grant Foundation, which is an education and youth services research funder. And we found that we were not the only funder asking similar questions, such as, how do you invest in research that's likely to be used? How do you design grant programs for publicly engaged work? What are the structural conditions that are needed to enable this kind of research beyond individual projects? And this partnership grew pretty quickly. We started in 2020 as a small learning community, and TEFN, the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, has now grown to include more than 80 funding organizations in 10 countries, including 16 public funding agencies and small and large philanthropies. Next slide, please. Many of these funders have taken an approach of investing in types of research that, for the purposes of this project, we've put under the umbrella of societally impactful research. So many different names, and we've been intentionally broad in our tent because we found that the challenges in mobilizing research for impact and engaging research users in the research process are similar, whether you're thinking about technological innovation in the engineering space, often using terms like translational or use-inspired research, as well as community engagement and policy engagement. And so we've used this very broad umbrella intentionally, but These approaches are often partnered, targeted to the needs of research users, and share similar structural challenges in enabling them, both from a funder perspective and from a research perspective. Next slide. So our team at Pew operates a learning community among the funders network that I mentioned. And aside from that learning community, we aim to accelerate aligned and collective action on certain shared systems level priorities, such as building a coordinated evidence base on how research is used and how engagement can lead to impact in the research process, catalyzing partnerships across geographies and across contexts, and the focus of this project, transforming academic research incentives. TEFN participants found very early on in our work that too many of their grantees struggled with a similar challenge, which is that the kind of publicly engaged, policy relevant work that they prioritized was not easy to undertake under current incentive structures and cultures in their universities and in their disciplines. Those cultures and those incentives were too narrowly focused on academic and scholarly impact and didn't fully account for researchers' publicly facing work. Our network has not been interested in erasing the infrastructure and possibilities that are there for promotion under academic and scholarly approaches, but we have been interested in broadening those incentives so that researchers, community engaged, policy relevant, and publicly facing work can be a space where they can thrive in academia as well. You can go to the next slide. So a number of TEFN funders have already been tackling this problem individually when we launched this project. These are a few of the grant programs that have been supported. So just to highlight a couple, the Institutional Challenge Fund for Research Culture is a program funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK that supports, actually one of the first programs we're aware of to use a largely lottery-based funding mechanism to support university teams to improve their research culture at about 20 UK universities. The Institutional Challenge Grant is administered by the William T. Grant Foundation, but supported by 3 or 4 other foundations in the US that supports research practice partnerships in education and youth development, and also the work of institutional change to enable those partnerships at research universities. The Bridging the Gap program is a program funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which aims to expand the infrastructure for policy engagement among international affairs and political science scholars across universities, across their disciplines. They're Transforming Academia for Equity supports teams in schools of public health. This is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation program to assess the culture and structure in their school and make some institutional changes that enable health equity. And the NSF recently launched its inaugural round of accelerating, I should say, research translation grants to about 18 pairs of universities in the US to build capacity for translational research. So as you can see, these programs are wide-ranging. Between them, they're supporting campus teams to undertake the hard work of institutional change and build capacity for societally impactful research at least 50 universities. But they weren't connected to each other when we started our work with TEFN. And so we have been trying to understand how can coordinated activity and aligned activity in the funding community really accelerate and take advantage of the momentum, not only in these grant programs, but more broadly across higher education. And so we commissioned this scan to try to help us answer some of those questions. And so without more from me right now, I'm really happy to introduce the panelists that we have today. And I'll introduce them all and then hand this off to Emily. So Dr. Emily Ozer is a professor in community health sciences at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health and recently started as director of the UC Berkeley Institute of Human Development. She also, if that's not enough, serves as faculty liaison to the provost on public scholarship and community engagement, where her institutional change work is influencing university policy, and co-directs the UC system-wide community engagement network. Her research focuses on promoting the healthy development and empowerment of adolescents, bridging participatory research approaches and prevention science in school-based interventions. Dr. Jennifer Renick is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling, Educational Psychology, and Research at the University of Memphis. Her research is focused on the intersection of community, developmental, and educational psychology on issues such as how to improve school climate and connection for historically underserved adolescents. She's a community engaged researcher with prior experience facilitating research practice partnerships with both schools and educational nonprofit organizations and conducting youth participatory action research. With this background, another area of her interest focuses on best practices for ethical social science research, considering different community-based and participatory approaches. Dr. Bruce Jentleson is the William Preston Few Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University. He also holds fellow positions at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He was the longtime co-director and is now senior advisor to the Bridging the Gap project, promoting greater policy engagement among academics. His work focuses on American foreign policy and contemporary affairs. He has a book out just last year or the year before on sanctions, what everyone needs to know, which bridges the academic and policy worlds, addressing both scholarly debates and policy challenges. And in 2018, he co-chaired Duke's Tenure Standards Committee and drew on that experience for our project. And finally, Dr. Bemmy Maharramli is the Director of Innovation and Landscape Management at Eco Agriculture Partners, where she leads efforts to advance integrated landscape management to promote sustainable land use practice. At the time of this scan, she played a significant role at the UCLA Center for Community Engagement, where she provided leadership in advancing community engaged research, teaching, and learning institutionally across campus, including overseeing the center's environmental and international development partnerships. So really pleased to introduce this esteemed panel, really grateful for all of their work on this project and looking forward to hearing from them today. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Benjamin, for really setting the context and also for the support of you all and TEFN in this work, which has been extremely meaningful. So as Benjamin mentioned, there's a broader momentum here. I think you all are probably on the call or part of that in one way or another, but I wanted to note the ways in which this debate or this work has made its way into broader higher education conversations, including this recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, which focuses on a lot of what's happening at UCs and other of our institutions across the country. Next slide. So as Benjamin mentioned, it's really about broadening the bar of what counts in faculty evaluation. This is a slide from Professor Rich Carter at Oregon State, who leads the PTI network, and they're focused on innovation and entrepreneurship, but have some interesting overlaps in the Venn diagram in terms of really broadening the bar in terms of assessing quality and impact of research. So I like this slide, and I really like the framing that they use, even though there are, in some ways, some distinctions in our communities. Next slide, please. So here's how we have framed this work at UC Berkeley, where I've been a faculty member for about 20 years. We're a public university, and public purpose is core to our university mission and identity. It's really about how are we as a public institution, how is our research addressing the massive societal challenges? We already know that faculty are contributing, investigators are contributing and want to do this work, and we see that as integral to our excellence, our impact. But what are the supports that we have, the institutional supports and incentives in our culture? And so that's how I came to this work. Benjamin mentioned the William T. Grant Institutional Challenge Grant. through that funding and the funding, it really our engaging with that grant mechanism kind of shifted from someone who was doing my own partnered scholarship in around youth development and equity to really focusing on the institution itself and how we could be making changes for the long term. Next slide. So that's how I came to the work. I want to turn it over to the others on the team to share where they're coming from. So Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So for me, yeah, it's sort of two-pronged. I conduct community engaged research, and as a junior scholar who will be up for promotion and tenure in a few years, this is a really important topic to me. And there's an growing body of research highlighting how important the ability to participate in an engaged scholarship is for more junior faculty, for scholars who are women, scholars of color, et cetera. And so that also makes me really interested in this topic more broadly, thinking about sort of the ecological context of universities and how we can make them more hospitable to this kind of work. I'll pass it to Bruce.
Yeah, thanks very much to my colleagues. I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, in my own career, I've had a number of opportunities to take leads from the university and serve in foreign policy positions in the State Department, as an aide to U.S. senators and other capacities. And I just learned so much. That's made me a better teacher, a better scholar. And I feel hopefully I contributed something from a scholarly point of view, not so much knowing more or better than others, but different perspectives. And also I think for us in universities, and this is a theme throughout our work, we are such important institutions in society, and to be more open to this kind of applied research across disciplines broadens us. It doesn't take away from basic research or pure scholarly research, but it really in some ways fulfills our mission of what we need to be as institutions in society. So over to Bemmy, right?
Hello, all. So I worked as a practitioner in the international development and environmental field for a bit, and then went back for my PhD, but always had a very applied, action-oriented, transdisciplinary approach. So looking at the environment and food security, the environment and public health, and wanting to how do you solve these wicked challenges in a way that considers social justice, that's transdisciplinary, that's community engaged. So that was core to my PhD process, and identity that I had going into it, but that emerged. And then at UCLA Center for Community Engagement, it was something I got to do sort of across scales with faculty, institutionally, with things like the UC Community Engagement Network, departments and what have you, and in the environmental field, but also more broadly in thinking about how do you affect change, how do you create communities of practice. So working with a lot of folks on this call it's great to see today, and then return to the practitioner field that I came from, now Eco-Agriculture Partners, who I'd worked with like years and years before, and really applying my PhD in a cool way to do and to facilitate community engaged learning and research with global partners around the world in the environmental field around integrated landscape management. So I sort of have this window from different perspectives, the academic perspective, and how important I think that the university role can be if it's aligned correctly, but the challenges therein, and then now from the practitioner perspective as well. So many hats. Great to be here.
Next
I
slide.
think I passed. Yeah.
And this slide is just here briefly, since we are a California focused group today, to also acknowledge, as we mentioned before, that we have a group across the UC system co-organized with leaders at UC Davis and UCLA, but including all 10 campuses, and that there's been some exciting movement in trying to really formalize our network and engage the state more broadly. I know that at the last meeting, we had a representative from CSU doing this work as well. And so really excited about the ways that UC, CSUs, other institutions and organizations across California can be in conversation and can be moving this work forward in ways that hopefully lift all boats. So with that, I want to turn it back to Jennifer to focus on the scan.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So we can go to the next slide. So first of note, so the scan was written into a white paper that's available at the Pew's website. I just dropped that link in the chat. So we'll be covering some, high-level takeaways, focusing on what we thought might be of greatest relevance to this audience. And of course, we can dive into greater detail in the Q&A. But if you'd like to read sort of the entirety of our findings, they are available there. If you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so a bit about the scope of the scan. So our goal was to provide an overview and comparison of promising attempts to strengthen faculty advancement incentives to reward societally impactful research. This wasn't meant to be exhaustive, but just sort of provide us a general overview of what's happening in this particular area. The main ways that we gathered information for the scan were to do interviews with key individuals engaged in institutional change. This, for the purposes of the universities, typically included faculty or administrators, often sometimes those who included occupied some dual roles. And with that purposive sample, the goal was to try and get, some diversity in terms of geography. We had public and private institutions. We had R1s and R2s, so mainly research-focused universities. And then we also made sure to include minority-serving institutions and historically Black colleges as well. We also conducted a review of university and professional organization reports, websites, and artifacts. And then also in recognition of some of the other key players in this research ecosystem, we conducted some interviews with selected high-level staff of professional organizations, and Bemmy will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So we included 10 organizational cases to provide, broad landscape of here are some other key players, not based at universities as well, and then did some additional literature review of higher ed journals and related sources to try and round out the scan as a whole. And we can go to the next slide. So getting into sort of biggest picture overarching findings, so we did find quite encouragingly that there's some significant initiatives ongoing to support and recognize societally impactful scholarship across a diversity of academic institutions and organizations. Something you'll see as sort of a key theme as we go forward is there is a lot of, understanding sort of alignment between university mission, goals, and resources, and then what sort of innovations were maybe going to be the most easily applicable for them or the most relevant. However, despite a lot of that really encouraging information we found, we also did see that university practices, policies, and culture, including promotion and tenure policies, continue to undervalue societally impactful scholarship, and that despite a lot of momentum in this area, there's still a lot of areas for new work to be done, and that's something we're hoping from the collaborations that are potentially emerging from the scan and building a broader network in this area that we can help sort of address some of those persistent challenges and pain points. And then lastly, since the scan was produced for the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, which is, this diverse group of folks with different sort of funding goals, we did find that there's a range of opportunities available for actors to support societally impactful scholarship. This both including, funders, like I mentioned, but also different individuals, whether they be sort of in some of these outside, like disciplinary organizations who can help shift some norms, even folks like journal publishers, et cetera. We can go to the next slide. So getting into a bit more granularity about what we found in terms of some of the things that we saw occurring at those universities. The first sort of at the broadest campus level was, campus-wide policy revisions and guidelines, really trying to change some of the language and the promotion and tenure standards themselves. The next was around review structures and supports. So some of this was campus-wide and some of this was a bit more specific to, colleges or departments, with the understanding that, in some kind of departments, this is very normative to do community engaged research and for others less so. So trying to think, it's one level to sort of have these new guidelines. What does it mean to really implement them and make sure there's adequate capacity building? Which again brings into the next one about capacity building at even sort of one level down. Something that we saw was really thinking about capacity building for individual faculty, for deans, et cetera, so that we're thinking sort of broadest level and then going continuously down. And then the next were a couple sort of specific approaches that we saw. One was to develop these centrally supportive, prioritized initiatives. Oftentimes these are sort of interdisciplinary centers on campus, sometimes supported by new influxes of funding. And then lastly, was aspects of technical support and identity development, particularly thinking about some of the ways in which, universities being cognizant of sometimes changing university priorities, we're trying to, adopt different initiatives approach to ensure this is really built into the university culture, so it'd be less malleable to potential changes going on. We can go to our next slide. And so the first theme, which I'll be talking about before handing it off, is the sort of theme of variation. Again, because we had this intentional sample of different kinds of universities, it was important for us to attend to this contextual variation that we saw. In particular, we saw that, there was diverse intervention points depending on university mission, their governance structure, the size of the university, the resources they had access to, their institutional culture, and also their rank. And some examples of what this looked like included capacity building for promotion and tenure policy, understanding, and individual case development. For example, the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, they developed an actual review team to assist with this. We saw UNC Greensboro, one of their main efforts was to provide seed grants to support faculty. Duke provided some support via their graduate student academy. We saw other universities with access to other kinds of resources, devote significant funding to internal community engagement research funding that then could, provide a foundation to build these large multi-component investments like Stanford. And then in particular in the issues of what we saw with the UC case, the role of having strong faculty governance, so sort of build this from the middle out, and also cross-campus organizing, thinking about what it looks like to do this within a system like the UC-wide system. I'll pass it to Emily for the next slide.
Thanks, Jennifer. So across the board, we saw different ways in which universities took up the needed capacity building here. And I think all of us understand that even if you're changing guidelines, once you change guidelines, it's a big question about how you would actually change culture and have the capacities to really implement that and do that kind of culture change. So we saw, for example, important models of universities developing resources and infrastructure to help faculty navigate the P&T process. So for an example, workshop series at University of Minnesota, Portland State collecting professional dossiers of engaged faculty, and other kinds of mechanisms, internal mechanisms for junior and mid-career faculty. So some examples to call out here are UNC Greensboro, Pathways and Partnerships, Portland State faculty mini grants, and some joint appointments at University of Maine. So some different models, and obviously it's not one size fits all because there's a lot of different types of institutions and different kinds of resources. Next slide, please. So in looking at the change stories and understanding what was the role of the kind of faculty-driven, if you will, bottom-up processes, as well as change stories where we had leaders coming in kind of at the top, if you will, chancellors and provosts really trying to make these changes, and everything in between. And because our audience, our primary consultants, we were consulting to a group of funders, we wanted to pay attention to really looking at the ecology of the academic institutions, but also the broader research ecosphere, and really thinking about the roles that funders and other organizations can play. So what we saw was, it was definitely a yes and. We saw important roles being played at the bottom, if you will, from sort of bottom up driven, as well as having that kind of institutional commitments at the top. One of the recommendations was really how the funders might convene some of the leaders across the country, and as well as faculty level champions. I think one of the key messages I think that Benjamin and TEFN have gotten from us is that there's a lot of cooperation and movement building happening across institutions here, and a lot of generosity of spirit in terms of people sharing best practices and wanting to see this work happen across a range of different universities. And of course, when you're talking about tenure and promotion, that only makes sense because external letters are really key to tenure and promotion. So it really wouldn't make any sense at all to only be working at this in one system or one university. We really have to think about the broader ecosphere. But also importantly, that as funders, the funders think about their investments, to be very intentional about how you're supporting cooperation rather than creating competition that might actually undermine some of the important cooperation and movement building that's happening in this field. And I think we'll talk a little bit about later that there's important levels about thinking about the kind of funding investments for sort of different players in the ecosystem. Next slide. So another key theme that came up across the interviews, and I could certainly relate to in our own change work on our campus, is where do we stake the tent here? I mean, who are the constituencies and how broad versus narrow? Because as you noted in the umbrella slide, it's a big umbrella. And for example, some of us use the language of community engaged scholarship. Others might identify as policy scholars. Others identify in many other ways. On our own campus, when we recently hosted a convening, we had folks from the professional schools who work on policy and governmental partnerships. We had people in dance. We had people in linguistics, people from gene editing. I think when we're descriptive, rather than sort of focusing on the terminology, we actually get a lot of people who are fundamentally doing different forms of partnered research across the bounds of the university. And I think when we're talking about faculty evaluation, there can be a very big tent. And then I think when we talk more about some of the other pain points around collaboration, there's some interesting overlaps and distinctions. When we talk about IRB and data sharing and financial systems as well, which was not the focus of this scan, but came up quite a bit in our interviews as another institutional barrier for this work. Thanks. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the broader ecosphere, thinking about the various alliances and broader incentive structures in those ecosphere was really key. I already mentioned PTI, the Innovation and Entrepreneurship group, that have some important shared goals and challenges. Other very key external organizations in this space that Bemmy will be talking more about. And as already noted, it's been really interesting in the scan to see all the different ways that the sort of different pockets of movement and effort happening across disciplines and across fields. So with that, I'm going to pass it over, I believe, to Bruce.
Great, thanks, Emily. I just want to build on what my colleagues have said already. The couple of points here about the broad alignments. One is, really, there's sort of a paradox in which people with PhDs consider ourselves intellectuals, but the notion that somehow you'd be, more narrow in what you think is the domain or range of relevant use of ideas and stuff, and only those within the academic world is sort of contrary to the sense of being intellectual. Again, I said before, I know how much I've benefited from my interaction with the policy world. It's made me a better scholar. I'm going tomorrow up to Washington to brief congressional staff on this book I wrote on economic sanctions. And I presented it at scholarly, workshops at various universities around the country. And I'll probably come back having learned some things from that interaction and preparing for it that I didn't learn from just, doing it among colleagues. So, there really is a value. It's not necessarily altruism or just service. It's really a mutuality. And I think there's some things here about the alignments that are broadly true for all institutions of higher education, and then tailorings for the types. And a number of the slides before, my colleagues' comments have been that, there are different. I was struck in the scan we did about how much is going on in the country. When we did the study for bringing public engagement and policy relevant societal impact of scholarship more into the Duke tenure standards in that research basket, it's about 5-6 years ago. And there's so much more going on that it gives you a sense, without overstating it, of the amount of innovations going on. And different institutions of higher ed are tailoring things to their particular organizational culture, the niche that they may have in competing with their peers, and a variety of other factors. So there's both commonalities and differences that make this not just an enterprise for the R1 universities, but broadly. And in some respects, it's really a battle for human capital, where people getting PhDs in a variety of fields now, have a real range of choices that I think has broadened over the last 2 or 3 decades. Private sector, various kinds of public sector, community sector, academic world. And for universities, if we want to compete in every discipline, my daughter did a PhD in art history, And there, it's, the museum world can attract people as well as academic. We want to compete as universities to be the best universities we can. We really have to be able to say to young scholars that you can pursue ideas that are scholarly relevant, but also connect to the world. And we're seeing this across Benjamin mentioned oceans and other areas that Pew's been involved with. So there are both commonalities and differences. And what we did in talking to the different higher ed associations is get a sense from their perspective about different aspects of this that each other can learn from in different areas. Next slide, please. We got the metrics slide here. There we go. Metrics are crucial factors in university personnel processes and P&T processes. We all know that. And the question of how to evaluate scholarship on societal impact is a different question than the standard measures of, journal impact factor, Google citation count, and the like. Here too, to refer back to the 2017-18 study we did at Duke, we researched other universities in the higher ed literature, and two things came out of that. One was that while those standards are important, journal impact factor and the like, they're often made to be as if they're the gold standard and everything else doesn't measure up. But you can actually see methodologically that they have flaws too, which doesn't mean to throw them out, but you get away from the notion that they are all that people need to know in these processes. And then when you look at the measures and the metrics, and we talk about this in the report, and we did a whole appendix on this, which I think we could also make available. How much innovation has gone on since I looked at this 5-6 years ago? Statistical techniques, beyond hits on a website and the like, that there really are ways of measuring societal impact. And so the more that it's incentivized, a little bit of cart before the horse, but the more that it's incentivized, the more people will put their methodological brains towards developing appropriate metrics. So the notion that one set of metrics is perfect and the other is totally flawed, it's much more mixed than that. And I think that's a very important factor, given the organizational cultures of universities, to making the case that you can also have metrics for this as well. So I'm passing it on with the next slide.
Thank you, Bruce. So now we'll talk a little bit about the role of organizations. And just to emphasize here, this was just a scan and we only spoke to, a handful of organizations and a list of many other organizations that play really important roles in this space are listed in the longer report. And so I just want to emphasize that, but it was really clarifying to talk to the organizations that we did. In terms of the role, these organizations that are not universities themselves, but are playing a really important programmatic and support role, like professional associations, nonprofits, et cetera. They play a role in supporting policy and culture changes at universities. So specifically, they're creating a convening space like we have today. Lead California has played that role and activating and facilitating relationships and networks within these spaces. Another important role that these organizations often play is providing consistent support and momentum around publicly impactful research and community engaged research, teaching and learning, because often in universities will experience leadership change, and there'll be sort of ups and downs of where universities are in this space moving forward, sometimes unfortunately moving backwards. And so organizations that aren't necessarily universities themselves can keep that support and momentum going even when there's sort of a flux downwards over time. And other important roles that we found that or other organizations can play is programmatic. Like I said, creating space and opportunities for learning. So, supporting, for example, faculty fellows is something that I spoke to one of the organizations about, creating publications, fundraising. So creating resources for these kind of efforts and advocacy. And so it's a really important synergistic sort of interspatial connective tissue in this space that I think that really needs to be underscored and acknowledged. So just a couple of highlights here are Lead California, who's creating this space today. So thank you. Thank you very much. And just one strand of what they've done recently, because they've been playing a role around, supporting community teaching, learning, and research for, I would say, decades at this point. But recently was facilitating webinars about P&T in relation to socially impactful research, and facilitating, like I said, relationships. And then also these organizations can be tools for tracking and measuring. So for example, the Carnegie Elective Classification for Community Engagement is a way for universities to be acknowledged for the efforts they're doing around community engagement. And what's fascinating is that the application process itself intentionally, which is a self-study, is meant to create conversation and thought and sort of infrastructure in place to facilitate community engaged teaching, learning, research, and public impactful, socially impactful research. So it's meant to do that by doing the application itself, which is pretty rigorous. And then also collaboratory. I think I saw Lauren here in the call. It's great to see her. Is also a tool that can enable institutions of higher education to make visible in quantitative and qualitative ways their community engagement, and to do storytelling, and so in a sort of triangulated way to share what they're doing, and to track that themselves and to share that with other organizations. And I know at UCLA, this was something that we were using with collaboratory and working across campus as a community engagement tool. So with that, I think I pass it back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Bemmy. And as you can see in the report, we thought it was important to frame these investments on different levels. And I think this is important for extramural funders, but I think it's also important for thinking about the internal resources on campuses as well. And I think we're most familiar with funding directly to the scholarship itself or to the investigators, whether that's through seed grants or through larger grants. And that's important. But I think what really we've been trying to point out in looking at the institution itself is where there are other important areas that really need investment beyond the research itself. So a second area is around the institutional change makers. And so, Benjamin mentioned some examples of that, but specifically funding folks like us who are trying to make changes on our campus. And it takes both time and skills that aren't necessarily part of our traditional faculty roles. So really being mindful of the kind of skills it takes to make those changes, thinking about fundraising and other skills, and the kind of organizing we've been discussing. Then third, thinking about the infrastructure itself. And so what kinds of platforms or infrastructure really need to be there. So as the faculty turnover and as partnerships turn over, what's the institutional memory, and how does that get sustained in terms of long-term culture change? And then lastly, as we've already discussed a little bit, ways of convening networks of leaders across systems, across the country, internationally, et cetera, for cross-learning and coordination. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of important next steps for research and evaluation. Some of those have already been alluded to, but we were really documenting these promising practices. But a huge next step would be inquiry and generation of evidence about what are effective change processes and how do those get sustained over time. Another, as I mentioned, is our focus was on faculty evaluation, but it's extremely relevant to be thinking about what we call the research pain points of doing this research as well, because there's only so much time in a day and you're not publishing papers and doing research if you're dealing with some of the headaches that often happen in some aspects of this research that involve collaborations outside of a university system. How do you create and facilitate these networks to support cross-learning and strategizing? And as I mentioned earlier, the intentional investments that support collaboration and large-scale change rather than competition, which is typically how folks experience, funding opportunities. So with that, next slide is just acknowledging the contributions and support, a range of funders, and also internally on our campus for the work that we've done. There's some links here, and then I know there are important links here, and I think there are going to be links. These links will be sent out along with the other materials. So with that, I want to thank everyone on our team and open it up to questions. Back to you all.
I just wanted to check. Benjamin, did you have anything you needed to say to wrap up?
Oh, sorry about that.
Sure, happy to. I thanks Emily and thanks Lane, and happy to just kind of share a little bit on the takeaways that we had from this project within the funder network, and some of the next steps that are ongoing or under consideration. So, similar to Bruce, we were really struck by just how much ongoing activity there is in this space, both at individual campuses and across the ecosystem. I think, members of our group were working in their own spheres, and we're not really necessarily aware of just how much activity there is across higher education, both in the US and around the world. So, including through coalitions like this one, like Lead California. So, the takeaway there is that the funder role in this is to accelerate progress, not launch it. There was also, I think, a strong recognition of how P&T fits in the broader scope of university and off-campus infrastructure, issues like IRBs, issues like professional homes, both at universities and outside of universities for this partnered research. And particularly some interest coming out of this scan in understanding that the campuses that excel in engaged scholarship are not necessarily the campuses where the majority of research dollars are currently going. So understanding the different levers to broaden the scope of the types of campuses that are receiving large amounts of research dollars, particularly those that already excel in this community engagement. Another takeaway is the importance of evaluating institutional change efforts that I think Emily was getting at this in some of her final slides. We hypothesize that this kind of work will lead to changes in who's promoted, what types of scholarship are recognized, and that ultimately these changes would filter to broader impacts in community and in policy. But from what we're aware of, that's a largely untested proposition. And so, I think there's opportunities to understand more what the process from institutional change to broader impact looks like, and use that in case making. And then lastly, the importance of metrics for this work. This is the question of what metrics do you use for societal impact and faculty evaluation is a really similar question to what's being asked inside the funding community. What are the metrics you use for the societal impacts of your research investments, and how do you apply those to funding decisions? And so, I think there's a lot of opportunity to make progress on this issue and apply it not only to faculty evaluation, but to many other uses as well, and want to highlight the work of the William T. Grant Foundation and others to support studies into the use of research evidence, because there's a lot of promising work coming out of that field that we think could be applicable here. Just a few next steps that I'm happy to share off the bat. We are already seeing on an anecdotal basis some impacts from this scan. I've heard from faculty and administrators at multiple campuses that the presence of this report has been an important tool for case making with university leaders and with colleagues in the faculty, both in its demonstration of funder interest in this issue and in its in the peer examples that it shows. I won't name names, but within state systems in particular, you can imagine that seeing one campus highlighted in a report like this and another campus not included might be an opportunity to instigate some conversations with the provost and others. Second, we've seen lots of opportunity to knit together diffuse efforts in this space. We hosted a workshop that several people on this call came to last year that brought together a number of the cross-campus initiatives and higher education organizations working on this issue, sort of a network of networks, and heard a lot of feedback that they didn't know each other. Folks working on community engagement, folks working on research impact were dealing with similar issues at individual campuses and across campuses, but weren't necessarily talking to each other. So we're supporting a couple other workshops this year that aim to accelerate that work and create opportunities for both these organizations and campus level change makers to share strategies, identify gaps, develop common language, and seed collaborations. Third, one thing that this report really emphasized is the opportunity to elevate this issue with key decision makers. I think a couple of the speakers spoke eloquently to where higher education institutions see themselves more broadly in society right now, and the importance of this publicly impactful scholarship for addressing very live issues in higher ed, and both with key decision makers and with the general public. So we're exploring how the Funders Network can play a role in that, both in partnerships with university leaders and also by supporting what we're Pew and 5 or 6 other funders from the group are supporting a National Academies workshop later this year that focuses on capacity building for engaged research and really aims to elevate this conversation within the academy writ large. And fourth, I think, to the first category, that faculty focus that Emily talked about, one thing that came through in the interview data from this is that how and what is funded matters, that funders have an important lever to play just in the work that they fund. So to that end, we continue to really focus TEFN's efforts on cross-learning within this broad, diverse funding community. And we've been forming a cohort of funders that are committed to changing certain grant practices to really enable them to support more of this type of publicly impactful research going forward, and are looking at how we can really accelerate our promotion of that work more broadly within the funding community to see more of those promising grant practices adopted. So I'll stop there, but this has been a really exciting project for us, and it's really motivated a lot of, we've seen already motivated a lot of energy, and curious to hear what questions you all have for the group.
Thank you so much.
And thank you again, Elaine, for hosting us.
Sure. I thank you all for making the time to be here and share this fabulous research. I'm not surprised to hear that you're getting good feedback on, it can be used as a tool to move the needle on some campuses. We always are grateful for having things like this to share with others. I want to say just a couple things coming from the perspective of a higher education organization that is trying to promote this, create spaces, as Bemmy said, to have the conversations, to do faculty fellows, institutes and trainings and programs, and then promote any of the research and resources that are out there. I want to say that a little bit of me feels deja vu. I've been in this field for 23 years, and there's some people, she might not be on the call still, but Laura Lee Sandman from the University of Georgia, now retired. But long ago, she and her colleagues were doing the East-West Clearinghouse about 15 years ago, where faculty could send their portfolio to get it reviewed by other faculty who had gotten tenure and included community engaged scholarship. And so, there was an effort back then, and I'm not exactly sure what happened to that service of those folks who volunteered their time to support faculty going up for tenure. But this is a conversation that has been going on for quite a while. I think what we're trying to do with our webinar series is provide some examples of places where they've been trying to do the work for 10 to 15 years and what has come out of that. I know some people are asking for metrics and examples, and I would say that the institutions that are included in this report are good places to go to look at what have they done. And I'm not 100% if all the contact info is included in the report or not, probably not, but it's not hard to go to those campuses and do a search and find out who's the director of the center there. And our next webinar will feature Dr. Andy Furco from University of Minnesota, who's going to talk a lot about the different ways they tried to and did make changes in the policy at University of Minnesota, and then his analysis is sort of where that how that's gone over the many years. I also want to just I appreciate you mentioning Lead California in this, and I just want to reiterate that the webinar series is done in collaboration with Collaboratory, which Bemmy also mentioned, and North Carolina Campus Engagement, which is our counterpart, working in North Carolina to support the campuses there, with Duke. I'm going to ask one question that came out of the registrations, and then we'll move to the questions that are coming up in the chat. So given the scan that you did you notice any variance between, and maybe you didn't look and analyze this way, but between public, private, and the teaching institution versus the research? I don't know if you can speak to anything that might have arisen from around that.
I can start by speaking to that, and anyone else is welcome to chime in. I definitely think we did see some contextual variations, still a lot of opportunities for, cross-learning and sharing. But I think for, a lot of the institutional leaders we were talking to at these different universities, they mentioned that, if you're making an ask of anything, you have to think about how it's aligned with broader university goals and mission. And so I think, for some of the public institutions they mentioned, especially if they're also land grant institutions, there's sort of this built-in overall value in the university of serving the local community, be it the state or specific city. And some of what we heard from some of the private institutions was this desire to sort of be like doing cutting edge research, thinking about what's most novel, what's most modern, and that sort of being some of the language they used. And so we talked to R1s and R2s. For this, we weren't able to talk to any primarily teaching focused institutions, but with some of the R2s, something that came up was this idea of sort of thinking about carving out a distinctive identity for themselves in the broader sort of university context. If, say, they're an R2 and they know there's an R1 not terribly far away, what is sort of the unique educational offerings they can provide? And similarly, some schools we talked to, though they weren't necessarily predominantly teaching focused institutions, they did talk about some of, the data collection they did from students, undergraduate and graduate, and how this came up as a value, which again, I think is something that I would imagine we would hear if in the future there's a scan looking more at undergraduate or teaching serving institutions.
I'd just add to what Jennifer said along the same lines. We did notice, for example, some R1, Stanford was one example, had invested quite a bit of resources, in these efforts, which come with, the resources a university like Stanford has. But what was interesting was that you had in each type of higher ed institution, right? So we mentioned UNC Greensboro, and I think we mentioned in the report, University of Minnesota Twin Cities, neither of which is the flagship campus of their state systems, in Benjamin's point, but it's a way of standing out and competing and developing your identity. And I think that probably carries forward to some private universities that see themselves competing with each other in different, tuition categories or general reputations, because it intersects with the desire of universities to provide more service and experiential opportunities on the teaching side. This kind of faculty can help you with that as well. So, there's a way of cutting into this for almost every type of university, even though we couldn't touch on them all, but I think that's, probably a good hypothesis to go into the next stage of this with.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from Jennifer Davison in the chat. She's alluding to something we noticed quite a bit. How, with so much turnover happening in university leadership across academia, do you have thoughts on strategies for sustaining this change making? We have a lot of examples of a chancellor or president who's totally into this. The Milwaukee situation is one that comes to mind for me. For the years the chancellor was there, they did incredible work, and then she left and things sort of fell apart. So did you pick up any thoughts on strategies for that I mean, you talked a little bit about the institutionalization, so I don't know if you want to say anything more, and if university leadership in particular came up.
I can add one thing, and then I think, Jennifer, I can pass it to you, but I think this was something when I was at UCLA, we talked about a lot in different spaces, for this scan, before this scan, in multiple communities of practice that I facilitated or co-facilitated. And I think that some of our collective people who I'd be talking with this about is that what's key is to make these efforts resilient. That infrastructure does need to be in place to weather changes, so to speak. You need the centers, you need those policies, those practices, so that it's sort of a norm. It's already there, and to weather when there's a downturn. So putting those centers, so it's not just at the top, but it's really sort of, built in infrastructurally across a system or campus or university, with the connections to organizations like yours, Elaine, to seek, what are we doing? This is happening. How do we what are strategies and support systems? Because, even I was at UCLA, we had great colleagues doing this work, faculty and administrators and staff doing this work across campus. And that was a great network. And also, as mutually beneficial of a network was the colleagues and the great relationships I made with colleagues across other campuses and organizations to sort of, workshop things. So I think you need that network, that support structure, and then you need to learn from others, from those networks, to think about how do we create a resilient system.
It's funny, you're reminding me, I was part of a research study back in 1998 or 97 when I was at UCLA in graduate school. And we actually did a study looking at, well, we had the service learning question on the Higher Education Research Institute survey. And we asked, and we found in one of the analyses we did that one of the best factors for promoting this was to establish a center on the campus. And that was back before 2000. So, and now we have so many centers on campuses. So I think that's a good point about the role of those. Anybody else want to add anything about university leadership and strategies?
I'm happy to share, a little bit of our takeaways on this, because I think it's a really important question. And ultimately, there's two ways to think about institutionalization. I think one is the structure, one is infrastructure, and one is culture. And I think I will probably misquote Elise Auerbach, who I see is on this call here and wrote a really good report for APLU about similar topics last year, which is that culture can eat strategy and structure for lunch in a lot of cases. And so I don't know, Elise, you can put in the chat if the correct version of that quote. But when you talk about culture change, then we're asking about really long-term questions. So part of it is establishing those structures, and I think the report had really good ideas for both university approaches and for extramural funding to kind of support the infrastructure, not only for changing a policy or a guideline, but for really instituting the implementation of those changes. But culture is a broader question, and I think it's where these ecosystem approaches come into play. It's why we've been trying to coordinate with these national organizations and these cross-campus initiatives. because there are horizontal pressures that can be at play here from disciplines and from membership associations, as well as I think some of the recommendations in the report that I don't, maybe Bruce or Jennifer can speak to on university leadership were around, it's not just getting university leaders on board with a new initiative or an individual change project, but really about socializing this vision for what role universities can play in society and how they can implement that vision throughout their campuses, socializing that kind of across the community of university leaders, so that when that chancellor leaves, you're likely to have someone come in who's willing to take up that baton. So those are all things that are very much on our mind, and trying to think long term about that culture change piece.
So there's a number of questions around metrics, but I think before we get to metrics, I'm going to ask another question that is also coming up. And that is something you just alluded to a little bit, Benjamin, of the network of funders. I think it's great to have TEFN and to bring funders together, but it seems like there's a limited pool of funds. Like the Institutional Challenge Grant is wonderful, but they don't give out very many of those grants each year. So there's a few questions like, how can we find the support to do, this relates to the metrics, to even do the deeper measuring that we need to do, the assessments we need to do to figure out what's most effective. But how do we also, maybe let's start with Benjamin, from your perspective, as with Pew and with TEFN, like, are there conversations about how do we get more funders to support this type of work? Or anyway, anything you want to share?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I mean, I think, from what we've seen, the TEFN has grown very rapidly for a funder network like this. And that interest to us is a demonstration that within the funding community, there is a very real conversation going on about, do we need to look at where our research investments have been going, how the research has been utilized, and what are the strategies that we can employ to make them more engaged, more equitable, and more impactful. And I think that this kind of work is right in line with where that interest has been, and it's why we're seeing a large number of funders come around the table that we've been setting to have these conversations. I also saw a question in the chat about case making, and I think that came from someone in Canada. And we've talked to colleagues there who have had similar questions and similar challenges. And I think that's a really important place where the community building and the narrative change can be really important. What the scan showed us is a lot of the work in this space is pretty diffuse, and that the narrative, it can be challenging to tell a narrative from about the ultimate impact of this work, because it's kind of systems level, it's process level, it's changing structures, changing policies, and changing cultures that enable broader impact, that enable greater equity. And so I think that's something that the community of folks working in engaged research, working in research impact, that this should be a priority to tell a compelling story, and it's something that's a conversation we're having within our network as well, to tell a compelling story about how these kind of structural changes can really make a difference down the line for the lives of the communities that we care about.
I can just pick up on part of your question, Elena, what Benjamin said. I mean, I think the TEFN coalition is very impressive. You know, when we first started talking, even before I knew the wonderful colleagues I'd get to work with, I was quite impressed with the number of funders, including big ones like NSF and NIH, you know, as well as private foundations. So while there's always a resource issue, this is a pretty impressive group, both for resources and credibility and prestige, right? And then, you know, some of the changes we're talking about don't really require large resources. I mean, I agree with what's been said by Benny and Jennifer. We want to institutionalize things and not just build them upon a particular leader. But if you're talking about, you know, changing tenure promotion guidelines, you know, the term that we use a lot is intellectual pluralism. So it's not just this new one. You know, there are 10 faculty positions open in a school, and, you know, 5 or 6 are committed to, you know, more socially impactful scholarship. That's not necessarily a resource issue, right? So there are ways of getting at this. You know, the other resource issue, and this maybe pertains more to private universities, but not just large ones, is donors like this kind of thing, right? Many donors, and I'm not even getting into today's politics, but like to support things that they see connecting to society from the local to the global. Some like, you know, a chair that is just purely academic. So there are lots of sources of resources. And the other point, I think, which leads into the metrics and part of what Benjamin said, there's a question in the chat. You know, what we tried to create here is sort of a menu of options. Which metrics are applied on a school or disciplinary basis is going to relate to organizational disciplinary cultures. And there's more work to be done. Some of the incentives there are for people whose scholarship is based upon methodology and measurement, right? Again, it's not necessarily a resource issue. There's some career incentives there for people to continue to say, okay, how do you measure this in a way that has rigor and methodology? You know, so it's not just setting up a new task force that's funded to do it. There are a lot of ways of combining approaches to move this along.
Thanks for sharing that, Bruce. I think it brought to mind something else that I have been hoping has been happening for a while, is that the newer generation of faculty coming in, and many of them do employ community engaged strategies in their teaching, and that is what their research is, community-based participatory research. And so we've been hoping for probably the last 15 years that there would be some turnover in the tenure committees as these folks rise in the ranks, and then therefore that broadening of what is engaged scholarship, what is scholarship, will change. It hasn't been happening quite as rapidly as I had hoped, but that is still something, you know, again, you're talking about culture shift, right, of an institution and the faculty. And I think, you know, folks are asking for specific metrics. I think, Bruce, you kind of mentioned something too, that I think while this report doesn't go, and the scan didn't go into send us your metrics, how are you, you know, into that nitty gritty, but I think part of it, I do think, is you look to institutions that are similar to your type. Maybe they're the aspirational institutions that your leadership says we want to be like. And if that is a campus, or if there are campuses that are like yours that have done this, that's where you would want to go and talk in more depth with those folks to find out how they did it, what metrics did they use, what, you know, if you're a faith-based, what's the definitions that resonated with your faculty and administration and community? So things like that. I think, I know a number of people are saying, what are the best 2 metrics you came across? Or, you know, examples of what you recommend. And again, I do think it's so different based on your institution, where you are at, how long you've been, you know, trying to make some of these changes happen on your campus. So Jennifer just dropped something in the chat, which hopefully will be helpful to a lot of folks. Do you want to say anything about what that is, Jennifer?
Oh, just since that individual is from association, something that we came across in the section on disciplinary associations was that the Modern Languages Association actually produced a report on this. So for that person's particular potential needs, I wanted to share that one. But yeah, there is, I would say, if you go, like exactly like Elaine was saying, if you read the white paper, we do have a lot of links built in of, this is something University of Minnesota has on their website, or the APLU report. So that can also lead to some of those more specific, guidelines and things like that. But I think it being sort of contextually driven and case by case is also definitely important to consider as well.
And if you're in this realm for a while, you'll start recognizing there are certain websites that have wonderful resources. The Emily Yonkey's UNC Greensboro website has a huge list of resources. I just often link to that because they've already put together a lot of wonderful resources there. Could you drop in the chat the link to the white paper one more time for folks? Yeah, I'm glad to hear there are some links in the report as well. Bruce, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Just the American Sociological Association is one of the associations we spoke to. It's in the report. AAAS, American Academy of Advanced Sciences, a number of others, Social Science Research Council, the Humanities Associations. But on the point you're making before, Elaine, that's what I was sort of referring to as the battle for human capital. I mean, I know in my field, political science, public policy, late 70s, early 80s, when I did my PhD, most people just kind of went straight on through. I find now people entering PhD programs have, done things in between. In my field, they may have worked in Washington, or they may have, done NGO work abroad, or they may have been in the military. And they're making a conscious decision to get a PhD, but not if you just tell them they have to write only certain kinds of things that go against their motivations for investing in a PhD, which is a big investment of time and money. And so very much that sense. And again, I totally respect anybody who gets a PhD that does not go into academia. That's not my point. It's more in a selfish way for universities to compete for that. And we started our Bridging the Gap program in 2006 or 7 with Carnegie Corporation New York support. And you're right, some of those people that came in as PhD students are now department chairs, and they're going to be deans soon. And that's anecdotal, but you begin to put a variety of things like that, and you get, some things to work with within the broader field.
So I'm going to wrap us up here. I want to let people know that, again, we'll be sending you this recording because you registered. And in just a sec, this is the next webinar on April 16th. The title is sorry, it's hard for me to cut and paste at the same time. Achieving transformational change in promotion and tenure policies for community engaged teaching and scholarship. And here is the date and the time. And Piper just dropped in the registration link. But it's Tuesday, April 16th, 10 to 11:30 Pacific time, 1 to 2:30 Eastern. We would love to get your feedback. So yeah, you can access past webinars on our website, leadcalifornia.org. If you go under initiatives, there's a section for faculty development, and all of the past webinars are there. And this one will be posted within the week. It'll be up there. And then in the email that we send following up, we'd like your feedback. So there'll be an evaluation in there. You can also fill that out and let us know what else you want, what other topics you want. And the survey, you can link on it right now for those of you who want to fill it out immediately. It's not very long. It'll only take you a couple minutes, but we appreciate hearing from you. And that'll also be in the email. So everyone who's registered will get a follow-up email. I'll ask the presenters if they're able to share this, if they're okay with sharing the slides. We'll include that as well if they are, and a number of other resources. I really want to thank our panelists again. This was a fabulous conversation. I'm not surprised we had so many people on. I think at the height we had 90 people on, which was fantastic. But it just was so such a rich discussion, and really appreciate the work you all did on doing the scan and then writing up the research and putting it out there, and for your preparation in doing the webinar with us. Anyway, if folks want to do a waterfall of thanks to our presenters in the chat, that would be great. And if the presenters can stay on, if you're able to, for a few minutes, we'll turn off the